Good afternoon. Uh, this is Lois Oliver, and I am reading from, as it says on the poster, a paper that I wrote some years ago. But my sources are available in the Forest Library. The person is Polly Murray, who was raised in Durham. And her famous book is called Proud Shoes, which is a history of the slavery in this country. And a book that was written by Patricia Bell Scott called The Firebrand and the First Lady, about her relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt. And so I think you'll find that Polly Murray is the most overeducated person that you've ever heard about. Her name was Anna Pauline Murray, one of 6 children of William and Agnes Fitzgerald Murray, born in 1910. When she was 3, her mother died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and her father became mentally ill. Polly was sent to Durham to live with her mother's family, grandparents, aunts, Pauline and Sarah. The extended family was very mixed racial, with Native American, white, and African heritage, and she described them as looking like the United Nations with varied skin and eye colors. She grew up on Carroll Street in Durham and attended Hillside High School, where she was an outstanding student. She refused to ride the buses or trolleys because of segregation and always walked or biked everywhere. North Carolina schools ended at the 11th grade, and Polly could have gone to NC Negro College, but she moved to a cousin's home in New York City and did 2 years in a high school in Queens to qualify for college. She wanted to go to Columbia, but it was all male at the time. So she went to Hunter, the City College for Women, starting in 1927. Her cousin's family wouldn't support her any longer, so she worked odd jobs and lived in a tenement, sort of hand-to-mouth. By the end of her sophomore year, her grades were poor, the depression was on, she was eating from trash cans, and she dropped out of school. One weekend, she and a boy who was her friend got married. This was not a success for either and only lasted a few days. A girl with whom she had lived before asked her to drive to California with her. So she decided to go and off they went. Just after they reached California, Polly got a letter from her Aunt Pauline asking her to come back to Durham as she was ill. Polly had no money or any way to go, so she decided to ride the rails. Her hair was short, she was slim, dressed in pants, and looked boyish. She made the whole trip to New Jersey, along with other tramps, on a few dollars she had, and somewhere someone took a picture of her for a newspaper, covered in soot and looking like the other guys on the train, only younger. She wrote an article about the trip that was published. Back in New York City, she re-entered Hunter, and with a good roommate for discipline, she managed to earn her degree in English in 1933. However, there were no jobs. She floundered around, finally getting a job on a magazine, but for 5 years, she was intermittently ill, malnourished, and finally had a breakdown. The doctor ordered her to go to a newly established camp called the TERRA, Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, a government-sponsored residential facility for unemployed women. It was jokingly called a Shishi camp as a play on the CCC camps for men. This was an Eleanor Roosevelt project. Here was where she first saw Mrs. Roosevelt in 1938. On the day of Roosevelt's visit, Polly stayed in a corner, curled up and apparently not noticed. After 3 months at Terra, she was asked to leave for 2 reasons. Her failure to stand during Eleanor Roosevelt's visit, and the presence of a book by Karl Marx in her room. She returned to New York City to a 1-room apartment in Harlem and got a job with the Works Progress Administration, then with the Workers' Education Project. She heard President Roosevelt give a commencement address after his honorary degree at UNC, in which he praised the liberal university providing great education, etc., and the adoring crowds cheered for him. She immediately wrote a long, scathing letter to the president about the fate of Negroes who could not get an education there, or indeed a good education there, and went on at length about the educational deficiencies that Negroes faced. Since she knew that the letter might never get through FDR's staff, she also wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt and enclosed the FDR letter. In Eleanor's letter, she explained that she was the girl who did not stand up when she passed through Terra, and went on to explain why she was enclosing the letter to FDR. This letter was the first of a conversation that continued until Eleanor Roosevelt's death in 1962. At the end of 1939, Polly went to work for National Sharecroppers Week, and while there, she sought Eleanor Roosevelt's support for the project of education and amelioration of conditions for sharecroppers. Polly produced most of the publicity for the campaign and participated in her first meeting with Mrs. Roosevelt for a discussion of the issues. She was impressed that the First Lady listened intently and possessed an inner beauty. In February 1940, the successful launch of the National Sharecroppers Week happened just as Polly was hospitalized in a psychiatric unit. When she recovered, she had her first break with the law. She decided to go home to Durham with a friend, and they took the bus from New York. When they changed buses in Richmond, the seats for the colored in the back were broken, and her friend Max said they could sit in a row just in front of the broken seats, back seats. When the driver noticed, he stopped the bus and ordered them to move back. Max said she had a bad back and could not sit on broken seats. The driver summoned some police, and there was a lot of arguing, and Mac kept insisting that she had paid and had the right to a good seat, colored or not. The driver then did some repair to the seat, and they moved back. All seemed well until the driver passed comment cards out to the white passengers, but not to Polly and Mac, who protested that they should get cards as well. Then they were arrested and jailed. They were charged with disorderly conduct, violating a state statute, mandating racially segregated seating on public buses, and fined $5. The NCAAP and the Workers' Defense League helped with the appeal, but lost, although the prosecution dropped the violation of segregation charge. Polly continued her protest about the charges, including writing to Mrs. Roosevelt about it, but finally gave up and went back to New York City. She went back in August of 1940 to work for the Workers' Defense League and was put on a committee that was going to defend a young man named Odell Waller. A 23-year-old tenant farmer from Virginia had shot his landlord. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to die in December of 1940. Polly was charged with finding out about the case, and she investigated and found that the jury was mostly landowners. Waller's attorney did no investigation, and in general, Waller's crime was most likely self-defense. She threw herself into gathering facts, raising money for appeal, and writing to Eleanor Roosevelt for her help. She brought Waller's mother to stay with her and took her to visit her son in prison and eventually to meet with Mrs. Roosevelt. Her efforts with the League resulted in several stays of the execution, and she and Mrs. Waller traveled to 20 cities, giving speeches to ever larger crowds about the injustice. Polly wrote articles and papers, and gradually letters and telegrams were going to the governor from all over, requesting clemency for Odell Walker. Polly was meanwhile struggling with her long-standing desire to be a writer and her other desire to make a difference for her people. As she became exhausted in working on the Waller Project, she accepted an offer to give a series of talks about sharecropper problems in exchange for a free cabin in the Catskills in the summer of 1941. She settled in to just write. She wrote some poetry and some sketches that would eventually mature into her book, Proud Shoes. She had been for some time, pressured by Leon Ransom, a Howard University professor, and Thurgood Marshall to become a lawyer. And over this summer, she decided she couldn't live as a writer and applied to Harvard Law School after being assured by Ransom that she would get a tuition scholarship. Howard Law School. After being assured by Ransom that she would get a tuition scholarship. She entered in the fall of 1941. Despite efforts on many sides and a pitiful note from President Roosevelt, Odell Walker died in the electric chair in July of 1942. Law school brought Polly another cause to battle. There were 2 women in her entering class, and the other woman left after the first semester. She had 4 very supportive professors whom she admired, and several who were openly hostile to having a woman student. Unlike her less than disciplined approach to college at 19, she set out to be the best possible law student. She also coined a new term, Jane Crow, for the situation of black women in general. They do as much as or more than men and get no credit for it. Of course, at the end of her first semester, Pearl Harbor happened, and the war effort and the draft began. Polly wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt about the heavy burden this placed on her and her husband to express her sympathy. She was still adamant in her letters that it was time to pass a federal law about lynching and segregation, since now the Negroes were fighting just like the white men, but were still not being treated the same at home. She was appalled at the interning of Japanese Americans on the West Coast and let the President and Eleanor Roosevelt know about it, comparing it to apartheid. She wrote a paper for one class that Thurgood Marshall used eventually in the Supreme Court decision that ended school segregation. She argued that the separate but equal always concentrated on the equal, but the real problem was the separate. There would be no need for education to be equal if it weren't separate, as it would be the same for both races. In her second year, she organized the students to integrate a neighborhood restaurant. The students were trained to be polite, well-dressed, non-threatening, sort of Gandhi-like. They entered, sat down, ordered their lunch, and were denied service. They opened books or sat quietly and read and studied. Other students lined up outside with placards or banners that simply said, "We are fighting together. Why can't we eat together?" Since once the restaurant was full and no one else could get in, they closed. After a couple of days of this, the owner caved and served them. Then they moved on to another restaurant and were successful there as well, but the university decided it caused too much notoriety and forbid the students to continue, and only the first restaurant continued to serve Howard students. Polly was invited to the White House twice during her Howard days to meet with Eleanor Roosevelt. She would never go without a friend or companion, as she was always uncomfortable to be singled out. She continued to write often, especially when an issue of racism or sexism came to her attention, and she thought Eleanor would comment on it in her daily newspaper column. She did often include information supplied by Polly. She also did occasionally sharply criticize Polly for overstepping her bounds. Polly finished law school first in her class and as Chief Justice of the school court. The President and Mrs. Roosevelt sent her flowers, which really touched Polly, though she was embarrassed to let her classmates know. She was awarded a fellowship for graduate school and immediately applied to Harvard Law School. That's where I got the Harvard part. But to no avail. She was turned down because she was a woman. She protested strongly and wrote more letters, but she eventually went to UCal Berkeley, the Bowles School of Law, Master of Laws, graduating in 1945 at age 35. Her thesis, Right to Equal Opportunity in Employment, was published in the California Law Review. It was her first publication in the Law Review Journal, the first published by an African-American woman, and the first law review essay on the subject of sex discrimination and employment. She passed the California bar exam. Her preference was to pursue a doctorate, but her finances wouldn't permit it. Her second choice was to join the Howard Law School faculty or the NAACP legal department. She discussed these with Eleanor Roosevelt, who suggested approaching an associate Supreme Court justice for a position on his staff and was interviewed, but there were no openings. Finally, the California State Attorney General offered her a temporary post as Deputy Attorney General after reading her law review article. After 3 months on the job, her Aunt Pauline's illness brought her back to Washington, D.C., where she was hospitalized, and she lost her post in California. She returned to New York City in the spring of 1946 and tried for a job as a civil rights attorney with several firms, but finally went out on her own. She did a backup job for the Congress of Racial Equality, testing the 1946 Supreme Court ruling that banned segregation on interstate buses. They sponsored 16 riders to travel across the South on buses across state lines. Polly found it reminiscent of her Virginia trip with Mac. In 1949, she ran for city council as a liberal candidate and came in second in her district. During this year, she had her long-ago marriage finally annulled. Then the Methodist Church asked her to do a study of U.S. laws on race and color. They wanted a reference book. The impetus was the women's division of the church. Polly spent a year, studied the laws of each state, and produced a 746-page book entitled States' Laws on Race and Color and Appendices. The ACLU made it available to law libraries, black colleges, progressive organizations all over. It became the Bible for civil rights attorneys. Polly was delighted that her name was on the cover in bright green. In 1951, she applied to Cornell for a research assistant position, but was turned down, partly because of the House Un-American Activities Committee work. The FBI had investigated her briefly. Eleanor Roosevelt was enraged that Cornell had been so cautious. Polly suspended her law practice and worked as a Department of Welfare caseworker and began working again on her memoir. Her literary agent finally helped her get a contract from Harper & Brothers and a residential fellowship at the MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire, where she could just write. James Baldwin was also there. From 1952 to 1954, she worked on tracing her family from Pennsylvania to North Carolina. She had a great surprise when she learned that the landmark Brown versus Education of Topeka case was unanimously decided by the Supreme Court in favor of the plaintiffs. The NCAA lawyers had used an essay she wrote in Leon Ransom's civil rights seminar as the background for the case. Murray had argued that segregated schooling placed black children in an inferior social and legal position and did violence to the personality of the individual affected, whether he is black or white. Then, excuse me, Polly collapsed and was found to have thyroid disease. She had a thyroidectomy and afterwards felt that much of her mood changes, highs and lows, had probably been related to this problem. Mrs. Roosevelt invited her to spend her recovery time at Valkill for several days. She spent the next year working to rewrite her book, as her editor found it not personal enough. During that year, October 1955, her Aunt Pauline died. Since she had been like Polly's mother, Polly was devastated. For some recovery, she returned to the McDowell colony to finish her book. Proud Shoes was published in October of 1956, praised by Langston Hughes, had good reviews by many newspapers, and the New York Public Library placed it on the Books to Remember list. Eleanor Roosevelt listed it in her daily column as enlightening reading. That fall, Polly got a professional opportunity she never expected to get. She was offered a position in the litigation department of Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. This firm had hired an African-American man and a woman before, and now hired an African-American woman. Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to tea to celebrate. At the tea were Golda Meir and other prominent women leaders. At the law firm, she meets office manager Irene Barlow, a tall, attractive Brit who worked her way through high school, finished college at night, was a very devout Episcopalian. Most satisfying relationship of Murray's life letters presents, never lived together but went to church and ate and talked all the time. She remained with the law firm but gradually became disenchanted with the work and in 1959 accepted a 3-year appointment as a senior lecturer in the new Ghana School of Law in Accra. Kwame Nkrumah was then president. She taught American style, expressed her opinions on civil and human rights, and helped students to understand democratic principles of government. She became concerned as she saw Nkrumah gradually infringing on civil rights, and his agents were suspicious of her. When a Yale law professor visited, he was awed by what she had accomplished. In a situation that offered little support, and he was awed by her teaching ability. He was convinced she would soon be deported. He urged her to return to the States and apply for a doctorate. She completed the next semester, and a text she was writing with another faculty member, The Constitution and Government of Ghana, which was published in London. She applied to Yale Law School and got a $5,000 fellowship to begin her doctoral studies in 1961. During her graduate school years, she continued her participation in civil rights action and her correspondence and her visits with Eleanor Roosevelt. She last visited Mrs. Roosevelt at Valkill in July of 1962 before her death and was present at her graveside burial. She attended and marched twice in the famous March on Washington, though she protested the absence of any women of note on the program. She advocated and won keeping sex as a protected class in the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act, and was given credit for this by some of the congressmen. In 1965, she got her degree, Doctor of Juridical Science. Her dissertation was 1,300 pages in 3 volumes, a treatise on historical and legal origins of U.S. race problems. She moved back to New York City and contracted with the Methodist Church for a monograph on human rights, served as a consultant for the United States Information Service and the U.S. Department of Labor, served on the ACLU board. She got together with Betty Friedan and Ruth Bader Ginsburg to found the National Organization for Women. In the spring of 1967, she was appointed vice president of Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina. And after a year there, she moved to Brandeis University, where she stayed for 5 years. She taught courses in legal studies, civil rights, began women's studies, and laid the groundwork for an African American studies program. She, of course, challenged all school policies that discriminated against women students, faculty, or staff. She continued to write. A collection of her poetry was published. She was promoted to the Lois Chair in Law and Politics as a full professor with tenure. In 1973, she abruptly resigned from Brandeis and returned to New York City to enter the General Theological Seminary to study to become an Episcopalian priest. She deposited a substantial portion of her personal papers at the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women at Radcliffe College. Some of this decision was the death of Renee Barlow, her friend in the church, who had died in February of 1973. Polly had worked side by side with Renee in the church, and it was to the church she turned for consolation. She was the oldest, the only African American, and senior to many of her professors. She did not know if she would ever be ordained, as women were not yet accepted as priests by the church. But in September of 1976, the Episcopal Church officially approved the ordination of women. And on January 8th, having graduated with honors in 1976, Murray was ordained in the Washington National Cathedral along with 8 others. In February, she celebrated her first Holy Eucharist at the Chapel of the Cross in Chapel Hill. The lectern bore the name of her slave-holding great-aunt, Mary Ruffin Smith, and the Bible she held was a gift from Smith to Polly's grandmother, Cornelia. The ribbon and dried flowers she used as a Bible bookmark was from the bouquet that Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt had sent 33 years before when Murray graduated from Howard. Charles Kuralt interviewed her after the service. She then lived in the Washington, D.C. area and served local churches over the next 8 years. She never made very much money and continued to write, including an autobiography, Song in a Weary Throat, published posthumously, and she continued to speak whenever she was asked. Finally, in 1984, she and an old friend, Maida Springer Kemp, embarked on a joint venture in cooperative yet autonomous living. Maida had an old house with twin apartments in Point Breeze, Pittsburgh. Maida lived on the first floor, Polly on the second. They did some traveling. Polly did a lot of riding and walking and exploring the city. She died of pancreatic cancer on July 1st, 1985. Now, the interesting thing about her is how she's been honored since. Yale has named a building for her. I mean, that's the end of my paper. But I just think that she was the most incredible sort of behind-the-scenes worker. She never took charge of anything. But you got to agree, she has more degrees in more areas than most people. Anyway, thank you for listening. That's it.